Hi apes, today we're taking a look at Unit 9, Part 4, which is going to focus on the conservation of biodiversity. So I want to start off by looking at extinctions. Now it's important to know that extinctions are not a new thing. If you take a look at all of Earth's history, between 98 to 99.9 species of all species who've ever existed on our planet are extinct. Now, there have been 5 past extinctions that we know about, and a lot of people seem to think that we currently are in the 6th extinction that is being driven by humans. And it is true that the extinction rates that we're seeing right now are 100 to 1,000 times higher than the extinction rates that we can see from the fossil record. And right now we are at about 50,000 species per year. Many of those might be species we don't even realize exist. Now, when we look at species that are going extinct, one of the key things that we have to take into consideration is whether or not there's enough genetic diversity for them to withstand changes that we're seeing now. Remember that species will have a range of tolerance of conditions that they can tolerate. And the wider their range of genetic diversity, the more they'll be able to adapt as a species and respond to changes and continue on as a species. Now, when numbers are getting low, we can classify them as endangered or threatened. Now, a threatened species is one that is at risk of becoming endangered, and an endangered species is one that is at risk of becoming extinct. Now, you might be able to have some populations that might go locally extinct, that you might lose them in one area of the world, but you might find them in another area. And some animals, they go extinct to the point where we only have them in zoos anymore, and then those would be the last of their species. Now, some of the characteristics of species that make them particularly vulnerable to being at risk of endangered or threatened status is they tend to be big. Now, the reason why a species that would tend to be big is at risk of extinction is because a bigger species, they need a larger habitat. And we are just running out of habitat space to be able to share with these animals. Being slow is a problem because often these animals are hunted and they need that speed as an adaptation, so a slow animal is easier to be hunted. If they're specialized, if they are a specialist, they can't adapt to changing environments. They can't find new food sources, so a specialist is more vulnerable to a extinction than a generalist. If they're marketable, if they have fur or body parts that humans want, we're going to hunt them more often. If they're a low reproductive rate, these tend to be archaea-selected species that may only reproduce every couple of years. That's going to make them very difficult to recover from a lower population. And if they're a top predator, some of the issues here is they might be more vulnerable to biomagnification, so pollution in our ecosystems, as well as a top predator will tend to also need a large habitat. And they may just not have the space available to them to have the food that they need. Now, there are some general threats that we can use to classify or to think about our threats to biodiversity. And oftentimes we use the acronym HIPCO, which is very close to hippo, so I wanted to put these pictures of hippos to remind you of it. So that stands for habitat destruction as one of our key threats to biodiversity. Invasive species, or species that we have either intentionally or accidentally introduced into a new ecosystem. Pollution. Population growth, and by that I mean human population growth, climate change, and over-harvesting. So I'll go through a few of these. So one of our biggest threats is habitat destruction, and not only complete loss of habitat, but also fragmentation. So when we take one large habitat for a large predator, and maybe we are going through urban sprawl and we build a highway right down the middle of it, that fragmented habitat no longer is no longer big enough to support a large predator. And so you might have a minimal loss of habitat, but by breaking it into smaller pieces, you've changed that habitat, you've changed the edge habitats, which are different than the central habitat, so you're changing the who can live where. Specialists are going to be impacted by this the most because you might have a specialist that requires this internal habitat, and you've created more of this fringe or this edge habitat, and our specialists may not be able to adapt to that. Also, our larger animals are going to be more impacted because they need the larger space, they need the larger territory. So habitat destruction can be a real problem, particularly when you can't adapt to these changes. And one episode that we've talked about this year is the habitat destruction of our very biodiverse rainforests, where we clear those diverse rainforests to plant that monoculture of palm trees, leaving a lot of animals with no habitat left to live in. Now, invasive species can be a real problem. Invasive species are those that are either intentionally or accidentally introduced into a new environment. These do tend to be generalists because they can adapt to that new habitat easily. So they can find food sources easily. They might be very good competitors, and they may not have any natural predators there to help control the population. And so this allows them to kind of take over an ecosystem. And so here are some examples from around the United States. One invasive species that impacts our Great Lakes is this zebra mussel. So it is a shellfish that grows on the inside and outside of pipes and boats and pilings, and it can just take over. Now, one benefit of this is they're filterers, so they've cleaned the water a lot, but not a lot of fish or animals will eat them in the Great Lakes, and so they don't serve a purpose in the food chain, and they take over space from animals that do serve that purpose. So they're better to competitors than other shellfish. This one down here is a snakehead that is in our area, and the snakehead was introduced, and it's a voracious predator. It reproduces very, very rapidly, and it can take over an entire pond or lake, and it is reproducing in our Potomac River, and it is eating a lot of our native fish, and not a lot of our native animals will eat the snakehead. And it's not only animals that are invasive species, plants are invasive species as well. This is an example of kudzu that was introduced into the South, and you can see in the winter it was dormant, and then in the spring, summer, and fall, kudzu is a plant that grows incredibly fast and can smother trees and outgrow other plants. Now, population growth is taking a look again at how humans are growing so rapidly and the need for hunting them. We do hunt our animals because to feed our overgrowing population. That can lead to poaching or overhunting or overharvesting. We also will hunt animals for the pet trade or for animal parts that we use for display. And then also along with our population growth comes a lot more pollution and pesticide runoff that's going to harm our insects and our plants and our animals once it becomes part of the runoff. And then finally, climate change is a real issue. And that climate change, we know that our temperatures are warming. And one of the key things is that the climate is changing so rapidly that our plants and animals can't adapt at that rate. And so what we're seeing is that there are shifting migration patterns or shifting feeding patterns that don't match up with the food sources. So plants are blooming prior to when the animals that need that plant are hatching, and so they don't have their food sources, or their migration patterns are shifting and changing, and it's not matching up with their food sources. So we're seeing a real decrease in the amount of our biodiversity. And so this graphic here shows you which animal and plant groups are most at risk. And so down here on the bottom, the red are the yellows to reds are the ones that are most vulnerable. So our cycads, our amphibians, dicots and conifers, and our corals are some of our most at risk groups of species. But you can see that this goes across all different diversities of animals and plants that are at risk of this changing climate. Now, we do have legislation to help us with this that has shown a lot of improvement. The Endangered Species Act, what this does is it identifies and protects endangered animals and their habitats. And that's the key thing, because that is the biggest reason why our diversity is decreasing, is because of that loss of habitat. So if an animal or plant is on the Endangered Species Act, not only are they protected, but so is their habitat. Now, CITES is the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species. This is an international agreement that makes it illegal to sell or trade endangered animals or their parts. And so while this doesn't make it illegal to kill those animals or harm those animals, it does make it not possible to profit off of it. So that takes away the encouragement of killing these animals if you don't have a public market to sell it on. There is still the black market, but this greatly reduces the desire and the need and the demand for these animals. So we are taking these steps to help to improve our biodiversity, and it is going to take both a national and an international effort to try to conserve this biodiversity that is so important on our planet. And you have now made it to the end of our lecture series. So this is going to be your last Ed puzzle, so do make sure you put any questions there that you have.